It's a pleasure to be here for this celebration of the Science of Spirituality Symposium. The topic for our presentations and discussion is spiritual experiences, consciousness, and human nature. I'm going to focus on the work that I've done with personality in order to understand human consciousness and what the underlying basic processes are within human beings that allow us to understand our consciousness and how to find health, happiness, and fulfillment in life. So we'll begin with personality because that is the tool that I have used to investigate these topics. Personality is briefly simply the way we learn to adapt to changing conditions. In the work that I've done with molecular genetics and brain imaging, we've been able to very clearly demonstrate that human personality depends on three heritable systems of learning and memory that all human beings share. These are associative conditioning of habits and skills, intentional self-control of goals, and creative self-awareness, which provides rational insight into what's meaningful and valuable. And when we use our human self-awareness, we're in a domain of learning and consciousness that functions as a narrative with context. And that context includes material, mental or cognitive and emotional things, as well as spiritual context. We'll develop what I mean by this context as we proceed. Consequently, we can say that personality is the organization within the individual of these three biopsychosocial systems of learning and memory that shape and adapt to an ever-changing internal and external environment. That can be summarized with this schematic of my biopsychosocial model of personality. I mentioned that these three systems of learning and memory, associative conditioning or procedural learning, intentional self-awareness or character, are heritable, but they are only partly heritable, and that about 50% of the variability in these learning systems is due to specific genetic factors that we have actually specifically identified, not simply estimated from twin studies. That means that environmental factors are as important as genetic factors, or that nature and nurture are always both important. So if we look at this schematic, we see that there are four habit systems that involve different aspects of habit learning or associative conditioning. These involve harm avoidance, novelty seeking, reward dependence, and persistence, which are fairly true to the labels that I've chosen, in that harm avoidance involves habits that involve passive avoidance learning and responses to stimuli that induce fear or anxiety. Novelty seeking involves the approach to things that are complex, new, and unfamiliar. And reward dependence in humans particularly involves our sensitivity to social cues, like a smile, that help in the formation of social attachments. And then finally, a fourth dimension of persistence involves variability that we have in our responses to intermittent reinforcement that lead us to be more or less determined to work hard to achieve our goals. Then we have a second domain of character, which is what we make of ourselves intentionally. And that can be measured in terms of three character traits that I've labeled as self-directedness, cooperativeness, and self-transcendence. And you see, this involves our regarding ourselves as an individual to achieve individual personal goals, as a member of a community or society as a whole, in which we can be more or less cooperative with others. And self-transcendence, finally, is a system that allows us to be aware of our participation in the transcendental unity of all being, the universe or God. Now, notice that temperament and character are always interacting with one another, so they're not really independent of each other. They actually need to interact in order to cooperate and to integrate themselves with one another. We have to integrate our habits with our goals and our values in order to be coherent and well integrated, mature. And as we do that, we become aware of what's valuable to us, what's meaningful to us, and we form an identity that expresses our underlying latent potential. So this is the model of personality that I'll be using to try to understand the questions of human nature and the different aspects of consciousness and what we can experience in terms of our spirituality, which is the seeking of what is beyond human existence. That is, to become aware of what is hidden to our physical senses and our logical, analytical, intellectual processes. First, let's look at three sets of interactions between these 7 dimensions, 3 character traits and 4 temperament traits. The temperament cube takes the first 3 temperaments, harm avoidance, novelty seeking, and reward dependence, and looks at how they interact with each other. For example, if we're very high in all 3 of the temperament traits I just mentioned, if we're anxious, trustful, and warm, and also impulsive and disorderly, then we have a very hypersensitive temperament that gives us many emotional conflicts. For example, we can both be anxiety prone from being high in harm avoidant and also be very novelty seeking or impulsive. And that will give us approach avoidance conflicts. And likewise, if we're high in reward dependence, we may be afraid of getting hurt in relationships. But at the same time, we need relationships in order to satisfy our needs for social recognition, attachment, and warmth. So these kinds of interactions give rise to a variety of our emotional conflicts. Turns out that the most healthy and adaptive of our character traits is what I've labeled here as the reliable temperament. And this is someone who is low in harm avoidance, but high in reward dependence, and also low in impulsivity. Likewise, probably the predisposition that gives rise to the most conflicts is the explosive temperament, the opposite of the reliable, which gives rise to many borderline traits. So we can use these interactions in our observations of people and in our observations and understanding of ourselves in order to understand what impact our habits and our temperamental drives, which are irrational, what impact they have on the problems and the satisfactions we get in our life. The character cube is actually our form of mental self-government that allows us to regulate these irrational emotions. And the character cube involves the interactions between self-directedness, cooperativeness, and self-transcendence. The healthiest of these is the creative profile in which a person is self-directed, cooperative, and self-transcendent. A common model of a healthy personality in secular societies that are skeptical about the importance of spirituality and religion and suppress self-transcendence as a result of that, is the organized profile, which was that described and probably preferred by Sigmund Freud, in which people are self-directed and cooperative, but not self-transcendent. And these can do quite well under many conditions, but not all conditions, and particularly is not very well suited to the current condition in which we have so much division in our society and really need to promote more sense of community and a healthier ecological relationship to our environment. The least healthy profile is the apathetic profile, in which all three character traits are low, so that a person is low in self-directedness. Life seems hard to them. They are low in cooperativeness, so people seem mean and hostile to them. And finally, self-transcendence is also low, and so they regard themselves as not having any afterlife or any connection to what is transpersonal. When you die, you simply die. So their view is that life is hard, people are mean, and then you die, which is a very depressing outlook on life. In contrast, the creative profile is much more adaptive and regardless of conditions, seeks to work in harmony with external conditions and also to optimize the congruence of habits with goals and values. So in that way, is the happiest of all the different character profiles, and also the most flexible and able to adapt to changes in demands for adaptation. The fourth cube captures the importance of persistence, which is on this vertical axis. Persistence involves being determined, very achievement driven, and enthusiastic with much energy and a very positive outlook on life, instead of being just easily discouraged and hesitant. Persistence tends to serve as a bridge between the character cube and the temperament cube, because it regulates our plasticity versus our resilience. If you're an alcoholic and you want to quit, but you're high in persistence, it's very difficult for you to quit. But once you achieve abstinence, then being persistent helps you stay sober. But persistence by itself doesn't have insight into what's important and valuable to do. And it may also be inhibited by being high in harm avoidance. So the three aspects of the resilience cube are self-directedness, which links us to the mental self-government, gives us insight about what our intentions are, and harm avoidance, which serves as a brake to inhibit change. So the most resilient people are highly self-directed and low in harm avoidance, and so they're rather fearless and outgoing, and they're very determined. The most fragile of us have the opposite configuration. So our adaptation to life is a constant process of regulating emotions, but also at the same time considering what is important for us to achieve so that we can have a coherent, well-integrated personality. And the resilience cube helps us to modulate changes in demands and intentions so that our understanding of what's important and what our goals are can lead us to persistently discipline our habits to be congruent with those goals and values. Now, that is actually a search for us to optimize our well-being. Well-being is defined as a complete state of physical, mental, and social and spiritual health. I combine those two because you'll see that actually the process is tripartite. That is, it involves three ways that are inseparable. We can measure well-being in terms of three aspects of well-being that are inseparable: physical vitality, including longevity, and functioning as a creative, reliable personality with positive emotions, the mental aspect of well-being, and then finally the spiritual aspect which is also the social aspect, which is virtuous living, which serves others by moderation, altruism, fortitude, sublimation, and other aspects of virtue. So you see, the human being has a body, has thoughts, and has a soul, something intangible beyond what we can see with our physical senses and what we can process logically in thought. But we have a capacity for recognition of what is hidden to the physical senses, because we are in resonance and attuned to this spiritual aspect of the unity of all being. And so well-being is expressed by its physical, mental, and spiritual aspects. Consequently, well-being always involves a search to optimize the way these can be manifest. It's a process of self-actualization. And that involves our being aware and living as a person who recognizes not only our own individual identity, but also the identity of all others. And as a result of that, is able to let go of all fighting. And that includes fighting with oneself or worry. And thereby we seek to feel good by doing good. We'll come back to this in a moment. Well-being then can be seen as a process of developing your personality to be internally coherent. Habits are consistent with goals and values so that we can function automatically and in tune with the harmony that is possible for existence. And that requires us to have an ever deeper insight into things that may initially be unconscious to us. So for example, return to our example of an alcoholic who may be a cocaine addict, who is really destroying their life and their health and their relationships because they're totally consumed by their irrational desire for consuming this recreational drug of cocaine or alcohol. They are at one level of well-being, but they seek to be healthier. We all would like to be happy and healthy and viewed as good by others. And yet to do that, we have to have a deeper understanding of what really is valuable. If you ask a cocaine addict what they would like, what they want, they'll often say cocaine. But that's the very thing that's destroying their life. So in order to give up the immediate satisfaction of this self-destructive activity and habit, they have to understand what it would mean to live in a healthier way. And that requires us to activate our insight, our potential for insight, and essentially to understand what's driving us to do something that's self-destructive. And that involves an enlargement of consciousness, which gives us the energy of activation to take on new habits with a new vision of what's important and valuable, and to move to a higher state of understanding and with a greater extent, and to a greater extent to be aware of our unity with all things. If we have an outlook of separation, we're going to have many fears, immoderate desires, and we'll tend to have either self-doubt or arrogance. And instead of that outlook of separation, we can develop an ever-increasing outlook of unity, which is also an outlook of virtue and an outlook that leads to health and happiness. Because this outlook of unity can be recognized by hope and love and faith in our approach to life, instead of fear replacing love, and excessive desire replacing hope, and arrogance replacing faith. So just remember then that the dynamics of well-being is to search for an understanding of who we are and our place in the universe that will enable us to be healthy, happy, and good. And that as a result of the nature of this complex adaptive system, we have a tendency then to increase in maturity and enlarge our consciousness in a stepwise manner. Now, the reason we're talking about personality is that it turns out that personality has a very important role in spirituality and health. It's actually the strongest predictor of both well-being and ill-being. It covers the full range of mental health and disorder, the full range of physical health and disease, and the full range of spiritual and social health, from a sense of virtue instead of vice, and a sense of community instead of separation. Human character traits are the components of personality that regulate our health, are regulating the expression of genes throughout the brain and other organs in our body that actually provide the mechanisms by which we maintain health and promote resilience, repair of injury, degeneration, and stress. And that has been recently published in a series of papers that Igor Zver and our colleagues have published in molecular psychiatry between 2018 and currently. Personality is also the strongest predictor of the development of virtue, self-actualization, and the enlargement of consciousness. A detailed presentation of that is in a new paper that's coming out in the Journal of Positive Psychology this year. But I also described that in my book, Feeling Good, back in 2004. Spirituality can be defined as a search for awareness of what is beyond human existence, which involves an enlargement of consciousness of our inseparability from the transcendental unity of being. I'll try to explain what that means in the following slides. First, recognize that all of these systems of learning and memory that I've described, the three systems of learning that make up human personality, in addition to general intelligence, can be attributed to 972 specific genes that we've identified in genome-wide association studies. These are nearly all expressed in the human brain, and over 70% or more of them are expressed in all our major organ systems. So these actually provide a way to unify the functioning of our whole body, all of our organs. These are not just for some mental process. These also are regulating all of our spiritual and our physical processes. That is, regulating associative conditioning, logical analysis by the intellect, and our capacity for meditation, mindfulness, and self-awareness, contemplation. We can consider the different levels of self-awareness, human consciousness, in terms of the three major steps that I've listed in this slide. If a person has no self-awareness, they're essentially emotionally reactive to external forces, so that they're irrational and driven by habits and traditions or customs. Most people manage to function day to day with at least self-interest in specific goals that they determine for themselves. But they're constantly judging and blaming external people and objects and conditions for the problems that they have in adapting to life. This really represents most people, the average person in society today, unfortunately. Most of us are not mindful or contemplating. But that is changing in that the newer generations actually have a much stronger desire for being more mindful and ecologically aware, and have a greater sense of community and humanity than was typical of the people who are adults in power today in running most of our social institutions. But that is another story that we can develop on another occasion. The second stage of self-awareness can be described as metacognition or mindfulness. And in this, we can approach things without judging and blaming, like an empathic parent or a confidant who accepts you regardless of what you do and tries to understand rather than to judge and blame and to punish you. The third phase, though, is to go beyond mindfulness, to actually enter into a state of unity. And that requires us to be aware of the fact that there are many things that most people are unconscious of that are biasing their very perception. If you have had traumatic spiritual experiences in which someone abused you or neglected you and showed no concern and appreciation of your dignity as a human being, then you may have blocks in your capacity to trust others and to enter into reciprocal social interactions with them. In the illuminative phase, we're aware of these biases. And so we're constantly trying to understand what must be unconscious to explain the bias in our perception. And that enables us then to broaden, deepen our awareness and to enlarge our consciousness in a way that allows us to more accurately understand what we can achieve in the future. One of the characteristics of self-aware consciousness is that if we have repressed memories in our unconscious, then it makes it difficult for us to imagine a healthy future. But as we become aware of these, then we enlarge our consciousness and we can achieve a more harmonious way of living. In the unity phase, we actually are able to identify with the unity of being so that we are more or less continuously regulated by our intuitive reason. And we have the ability to be flexible and creative in achieving the things that we recognize as valuable for not only ourselves, but for the whole evolving unity of being. Now, as we do that, we begin to experience certain things in consciousness, such as oceanic feelings and a sense of inseparability. And I've listed here some ways that the TCI measures oceanic feelings in terms of boundlessness, such as sometimes I've felt like I was part of something with no limits or boundaries in space and time. Maybe a sense of ecstatic union in which I had moments of great joy, in which I suddenly had a clear, deep feeling of oneness with all that exists. And also inseparability, that sometimes I feel so connected to nature that everything seems to be part of one living organism, or feel so connected to people around me like there's no separation between us. It turns out that most people have at least one of these kinds of experiences occasionally in their life. And as you see, sometimes this can be quite often. And what we're doing in trying to cultivate self-transcendence and deepening enlarging our consciousness and self-actualizing our potential is to experience our participation in this all-inclusive unity of being. Now, the three systems of learning and memory in modern humans allow us to do that. The people who I've described as being emotional in character and unreliable in temperament are those who are emotionally reactive, that is impulsive and hypersensitive. And they're primarily learning only by habits and skills, by behavioral conditioning. They have little capacity for emotional self-control or understanding of virtue. So that would be people without much self-awareness. And then the organized, reliable individuals are individuals who are highly competitive, secular materialists. And they can have moderate health until late in life when they begin to develop multiple chronic diseases because they're of their competitive, separate view of life. And then the most healthy people are those who have entered into a more transcendent way of living which their values are self-transcendent. And so they have learned that in order to actualize those values, they need to discipline their habits to be in line with them, which is the process of developing altruism and self-actualization. We've shown empirically that we've identified the genes for these groups of people, and that we've been able to show that the process of becoming more contemplative and self-transcendence actually activates molecular processes that promote healthy longevity, much pro-social behavior, and feelings of satisfaction, and allows us to manifest virtue in our lives. Now, these mechanisms for molecular adaptation and integration that promote healthy longevity can be measured in part by increases in heart rate variability and molecular processes for energy production, improved immune response, healing of injury, and various neuroprotection against neurodegenerative diseases. It also promotes pro-social behavior via the identification with other people so that we're more moderate and ecologically intelligent. And as well, we can recognize this because people who are in this state are also more creative and innovative, flexible, because they've been able to activate the more recently evolved late myelinating regions of the brain that are unique to modern humans. And we were able to show this by evolutionary studies in which we compared the genomes of modern humans to those of the genome of Neanderthals, as well as the chimpanzees. The chimpanzees only have the genes that for regulating emotional reactivity to some degree. Neanderthals have developed more of the genes for self-awareness and analytical processing of to discipline their emotional impulses, but they're intermediate between modern humans and chimpanzees in terms of their capacity for self-control and self-awareness. One thing that's very important to know is that we can promote awareness, and that involves processes of epigenetic regulation in modern humans that's mediated by a particular group of genes that we've identified. These are long non-coding RNA genes that allow us essentially to recode our own genome. And unfortunately, that can be blocked, however, by impairment of our capacity for perseverance and resilience by things like fear, stress, terrorism, chaos, confusion. Just think of the world's condition now, and you can see how our capacity for self-awareness is being impaired. And there are other things that decrease self-directedness, such as an emphasis on custom, authoritarian control, disinformation, and things that interfere with our capacity to know when to maintain a steady course versus to change and adapt. Things that impair social equality, emphasize the how we're exploited by others. These lead to distrust in the community and also impair our capacity for growth. We can recognize these three groups. They're often called in studies, in cultural studies, traditionals, materialists, and post-materialists or cultural creatives. I'm not going to have time to go into that in detail, but I want to share with you a metaphor that may help you to understand what I have learned about the way we can self-actualize and enlarge our consciousness. And this depends on Plato's metaphor of the charioteer that you may be familiar with. The charioteer represents reason or intuitive insight inspired by virtue. And that can be measured with the temperament and character inventory by being high on all three of the character traits. In other words, the creative character is someone who has intuitive reason. The unruly black horse that interferes with achieving virtuous, healthy, happy living actually represents our appetites, which are measured by the three temperament traits in the temperament cube. And finally, the noble white horse that assists the charioteer or reason to achieve a happy and good life is represented by the resilience cube with high persistence, high self-directedness, and low harm avoidance. In other words, these three systems enable us to have an integrated character. This has been described in other ways by Plato in some of his other dialogues. I've given you the charioteer metaphor, but you can also have a body metaphor of gut, heart, and head, or in the Republic, self-interested merchants, noble soldiers, and philosophical rulers. And these are expressed by our desires, virtues, and vices that we can observe in people who are at various levels of consciousness. So in order to express well-being in our life, there are three practices that we can do that allow us to put virtue into action. These practices involve our understanding of love, hope, and faith. Understanding of love is represented by TCI cooperation, and that can be cultivated by working in the service of others. The understanding of hope, which is represented by TCI self-directedness, can be cultivated by letting go of all fights. That includes fights with ourselves so that we don't worry and we're hopeful. And finally, the understanding of faith, which is represented by TCI self-transcendence, can be expressed by seeking to grow in awareness, letting ourselves be humble and accepting our limitations as well as our strengths, so that we can act in a way that is genuine. And these three processes then enable us to cultivate self-directedness, cooperativeness, and self-transcendence, which gives us a creative character, enlarges our consciousness, gives us an understanding of all the virtues that can be derived from love, hope, and faith. And that enables us then to become someone with the capacity to do what the diver of Paestum is doing in this fresco of jumping from a height into the unknown future, but with some love, hope, and faith in that process. We can understand that better that process better as a creative process. When we think about a trapeze artist going from one bar to the next bar, for the trapeze artist to go from one bar to the next, she has to let go of the last one. And so that involves change. So we're constantly, when we're growing, actualizing ourselves and enlarging our consciousness, we're often in this in-between state that involves us to be of what we're seeking and what we have to let go of. Now it's very helpful in that process if we have others that we trust and who provide us their support by reaching out their hands. And also, we have to foresee the opportunity and change. So you can see how love, hope, and faith work together in this creative process that enables us to enlarge our consciousness, to understand more about ourselves, to be less biased, less and less biased in our perception of separateness from others. So in conclusion, the health and well-being of Homo sapiens, wise man, necessarily involves our integrating our habits to be congruent with our goals and values, our self-transcendent goals and values. Because it's only when they're self-transcendent that we're really optimizing health, well-being, happiness, and virtue. We're an inseparable aspect of the transcendental unity of all being, even though we cannot see it with our physical senses, and some people can't understand it from the use of the analytical intellect because they haven't cultivated the awareness of what is intangible. The illusion that we're separate promotes disease, misery, and vice, as is prevalent today due to the widespread exploitation of people by fear and disinformation, and the promotion of excessive consumption, separateness, competition, and arrogance, all of which are self-defeating. Remember that the creative character, intuitive reason, our charioteer, our inner voice, guides us to physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being when we're persistent in self-control of our habits, reconditioning them in the process of self-actualization and the enlargement of consciousness. We need to be innovative and creative, resilient and versatile in order to adapt to the many challenges of our lives with plasticity, virtue, and serenity. Consciousness cannot be reduced to either matter or information. It is not simply it or bit. Consciousness is awareness of both matter and information, and understands that it operates within the context of the fundamental unity of all being. The most pressing need we have is actually to apply what we know now to living well in the midst of the confusion that's being generated by unhealthy societal leadership who are acting in ways that are self-defeating and cause much suffering for many people. We need to reform nearly all of our social and scientific institutions in order to serve the general public by promoting well-being, including spirituality and health, because these are inseparable from one another. So we've learned a lot about human consciousness and human nature. We have many challenges ahead of us, but I think that the work that's ongoing is at the Science for Spirituality and Health is very important to helping us to help society to evolve in a very positive way that can enable us to have greater health, happiness, and more virtue in life. Thank you.